Thanks. I am trying to get my mic situated. Good morning. It is Wednesday, July 4, 2018. Happy birthday, America. Happy 4th of July to all of you. Thank you for taking a little time out of your holiday to join us here on Java with Jerry. We got a special show prepared for you, so I'm glad you're here. As always, we're broadcasting, live casting, podcasting, whatever the heck it is that we're doing here, from the penthouse suite of Stadium Tower here in the Platinum Triangle in Anaheim. We're glad you're with us. You can pick up previous episodes, as you know, at Orange Sliced. You can pick up this and other episodes also at YouTube. And if you want to sign up for the podcast, and some people really like that, just go to Podbean, or you can go to Orange Slice and there's a link and you can get out to Podbean, and then you can listen to this while you're exercising or walking your dog or whatever. So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk a little bit about news, not much news, because what I'm really going to do is deal with the 4th of July. In fact, I think we'll just skip news and go right to it. This morning show is sort of a revised version of a show I did on radio, which involved a lot of reading, so it's going to be interesting on camera. But it was a show that I wrote a few years ago in honor of the birth of our nation, and I've been asked by a lot of people to bring it back. And so we're trying to figure out how this works on Java with Jerry, but we're going to do it in honor of our nation's birth. And so I think we're just going to get started because there's a lot to cover. I think it's important to remember the reasons why the American Revolution came about and how we came to be the United States of America. I think all too often on the 4th of July, the celebration becomes about parades and fireworks and barbecues and fun, and we forget what our founders faced in the 1700s in this land and what they endured in order to give us the freedoms that we're celebrating today. So one of the ways I think we return to an appropriate view of what the holiday is all about is to go back and read the beautiful words that Thomas Jefferson penned to encapsulate the thoughts of the founders at the time of the day. It's embodied in one of the most beautiful documents in human history, the Declaration of Independence. So let's begin this celebratory 4th of July show by listening to the words of one of the great minds of our nation's history as he expressed the sentiments of he and his colleagues gathered in Philadelphia in 1776. And he writes, in Congress, July 4, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, the first time that term had ever been used. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety, happiness, prudence. Indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms of governments to which they have become accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under the absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has become the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused to assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should first be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish their right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, distant, and uncomfortable for the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions of the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to the acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefit of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretend offenses, for abolishing the system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our government, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of the protection and wagering war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy of a head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioner of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections among us, has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppositions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which must define a tyrant is unfit to be a ruler of free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of the attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity. We have conjured them the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They, too, have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved of all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And that as free and independent states, they have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And so, for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And that document, the declaration, was then signed by 56 signatories to the independence which we celebrate. I think it's kind of important, at least once a year, for us to stop and read the beautiful words of the Declaration and to understand what was suffered by our founders that led them and compelled them to that. It's a beautiful piece of writing. Every time I read it, and I only do it once in a while, and I think we ought to do it on the 4th, it harkens back for me to the real reason we celebrate the 4th of July. So, what, however, was to come of that declaration? Let's think about what occurred. A bloody struggle for the colonists, for their freedom, for our freedom. A struggle which, for the first time in history, reasoned that governments derive their powers from the consent of the government. That was a beautiful piece of political philosophy that the founders were articulating for the first time in history. That was a truly revolutionary political thought for the time. It was not all in keeping with the history of political thought. Up to then, the crown by inheritance, or brutal conquerors by brute force, determined what the rights of governments were and of those they governed. And now this would-be fledgling state brings a clearly revolutionary idea that the unalienable rights of man are derived by their creator, and that the formation of limited government granted by the people with the sovereignty which it would be allowed should then be established for people to establish the government that they would like. And that document was signed, as I said, by 56 patriots in Congress assembled, and it has had a profound impact on the world for the last 242 years, and God willing will for hundreds of years more. But before we go off and celebrate our freedom and start our celebration today, let's talk a little bit about what happened to the brave founders, the brave Americans who pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor that day. What became of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, and just who were these men who had met in secret, subject to punishment for their sedition, risking everything? What happened to the 56 signers? Well, I have a little something that tells us a little bit about them and what happened to them. 5 signers were captured by the British as traitors. They were tortured before they died. 12 had their homes ransacked and burned. 2 lost their sons serving in the Revolutionary Army. Another had 2 sons captured. 9 of the 56 fought and died from wounds that they received and from hardships of the Revolutionary War. They signed and pledged their honors, their lives, and their fortune. What kind of men were they? 24 were lawyers and jurists. 11 were merchants. 9 were farmers and large plantation owners. They were men of means, well educated, but they signed the Declaration of Independence, knowing full well that the penalty would be death if they were captured. Carter Braxton of Virginia was a wealthy planter and trader. He saw his ships swept away from the seas by the British Navy. He sold his home and his properties to pay his debts, and he died in rags. Thomas McKean was so hounded by the British that he was forced to move his family almost constantly. He served in Congress without pay, and his family was kept in hiding. His possessions were ultimately taken from him, and poverty was his reward. Vandals and soldiers looted the properties of Dillery, Hall, Cleamer, Walton, Gwinnett, Hayward, Rutledge, and Middleton. At the Battle of Yorktown, Thomas Nelson Jr. noted that British General Cornwallis had taken over Nelson's own home for his headquarters. So what did he do? He went to George Washington and quietly urged him to open fire. The home was destroyed, and Nelson died bankrupt. Francis Lewis had his home and properties destroyed. The enemies jailed his wife, and she died within a few months. John Hart was driven from his wife's bedside while she was ill and, unknowns to him, lay dying. His 13 children fled for their lives. His fields and his grist mill were laid to waste. For more than a year, he lived in forests and caves, returning home only to find his wife dead and his children vanished. Some of us take for granted our liberties, and we celebrate today our 4th of July holiday. But freedom isn't free, and we shouldn't forget those 56 men and what they suffered for that. So I bring you that to remind you of that sacrifice on their part. And so out of that came a nation. It began with 13 little stars on a striped banner that are now 50, and certainly is a symbol of freedom throughout the world. And the symbol of that nation is a flag, and we'll see it everywhere on 4th of July. It's a symbol for which many have sacrificed, and the Declaration is recognized as the embodiment of the independence which it is a symbol of. Every 4th of July, that banner waves at parades and picnics and fireworks shows and local parties. For some, it can lose its meaning. At times, it's nothing more than a decoration, a patriotic colored banner, part of the holiday, and not much more. But it ought to be far more, and for some, it has represented that. Nothing, I think, explains the meaning of that flag and the pledge that we make to it, the Pledge of Allegiance, so routinely, maybe sometimes even thoughtlessly, than the story that was recounted by Senator John McCain about his friend Mike Christian. I read this story when I did this many years ago, and I've read it many times since, and I don't know if I can make it all the way through it because it really touches you, but I'll read you what John McCain said. Think what you may about whether or not you agree with John McCain and some of the stuff he stands for. He served with valiance when he was in Vietnam, and he tells a story about his friends, and he says, and I quote the senator now, "As you know, I spent 5.5 years as a prisoner of war during the Vietnam War. In the early years of our imprisonment, the NVA kept us in solitary confinement, or 2 or 3 of us in a cell. In 1971, the NVA moved us from those conditions of isolation into large rooms with as many as 30 to 40 men in the room. This was, as you can imagine, a wonderful change and was a direct result of the efforts of millions of Americans on behalf of a few hundred POWs 10,000 miles from home, but they appreciated being in that room together. One of the men who was moved into my room was a young man named Mike Christian. Mike came from a small town near Selma, Alabama. He didn't wear a pair of shoes until he was 13. At the age of 17, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy. He later earned a commission by going to officers training school, and then he became a naval flight officer and was shot down and captured in 1967. Mike had a keen and deep appreciation of the opportunities this country and our military provide for people who want to work hard and to succeed. As part of the change in treatment, the Vietnamese allowed some prisoners of their capture to receive packages from home. In some of these packages were handkerchiefs, scarves, and other items of clothing. Mike got himself a bamboo needle, and over a period of a couple of months, he created an American flag and sewed it on the inside of his shirt. Every afternoon, before we had a bowl of soup, we would hang Mike's shirt on the wall and say the Pledge of Allegiance. I know the Pledge of Allegiance may not seem like the most important part of your day now, but I can assure you that in that start cell, it was indeed an important and meaningful event. One day, the Vietnamese searched our cells, as they did periodically, and they discovered Mike's shirt, and within it the flag sewn inside, and they removed it. That evening they returned, opened the door of the cell, and for the benefit of us all, pulled Mike Christian out and beat him severely for the next couple of hours. Then they opened the door of the cell and threw him in. We cleaned him up as well as we could. The cell in which we lived had a large concrete slab in the middle on which we slept, and in the four corners stood naked light bulbs in each corner. As I said, we tried to clean up Mike as best we could, and after the excitement settled down and everybody rested, I looked around, and in the corner of the room, sitting beneath one dim light bulb with a piece of red cloth and another shirt and his bamboo needle, was my friend Mike Christian. He was sitting there with his eyes almost shut from the beating he'd received, making another American flag. He was not making the flag because it made Mike Christian feel better. He was making the flag because he knew how important it was for all of us to pledge allegiance. Anyway, when you're running around today celebrating and having a barbecue and decorating with flags, think about Mike Christian, because he paid a lot for all of us. A lot of men did, hundreds of thousands. Okay, so I want to wrap this. It's a tough story to tell. I want to wrap this by talking about two of the 56 men who didn't suffer all the terrible things that I described to you, but in fact turned out to be presidents of the United States and started out as friends and then became political rivals, and then ultimately, late in the twilight of their years, became friends again. In fact, there's wonderful pieces written about friends at twilight, about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who were two of the men in that room, one from Massachusetts and one from Virginia. And late in their life, they wrote letters back and forth to each other, and I commend them to you as something you might want to do on a holiday like this, or when you have some free time this summer. Pick up the letters of Jefferson and Adams and read them. They're beautiful pieces of prose. As I've said in previous shows, in the old days when men wrote, they took some time and they were thoughtful and they really wrote beautifully. And so I want to tell you a little story about what happened 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And we've talked a little bit about the 56 men gathered in that room suffering the chances of sedition. But now imagine a half a century later, the nation established, many elections come and gone, many presidents having served. Two of the founders are the only two remaining living. All 56 people who had signed that Declaration of Independence had passed, except John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So let me tell you a little bit about the death of the founding fathers 50 years later, July 4th of 1826. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, the second and third presidents of the United States respectively, die on the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. This is sort of a you can't make this stuff up. Only two remaining founders who had signed the Declaration remain alive, who had been there at the birth of the nation, and they both died the same day, the exact same day, and it happens to be the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Both men had been central in the drafting of the historic document. Jefferson had authored it, and Adams, who is known as the Colossus of the debate, served on the drafting committee and argued eloquently for the Declaration's passage. After July 4, 1776, Adams traveled to France as a diplomat, where he proved instrumental in winning French support for the Patriot cause, and Jefferson returned to Virginia, where he served as state governor during the dark days of the American Revolution. After the British defeat at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, Adams was one of the negotiators of the Treaty of Paris that ended the war, and Jefferson returned to Europe to try to negotiate a U.S.-British trade treaty. After the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, Adams was elected vice president to George Washington, and Jefferson was appointed Secretary of State. During Washington's administration, Jefferson, with his democratic ideals and concept of states' rights, often came into conflict with the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who supported a strong federal government and conservative property rights. Adams often arbitrated between Hamilton and his old friend Jefferson, though in politics he was generally allied with Hamilton, and the division between them politically began. In 1796, Adams defeated Jefferson in the presidential election, but the latter became vice president to Adams because at that time, the office was filled by the candidate who finished second. We don't do that anymore, but that was the case then. As President Adams' main concern was America's deteriorating relationship with France, and the war was only averted because of his considerable diplomatic talent. In 1800, Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, the forerunner of today's Democratic Party, defeated the Federalist Party of Adams and Hamilton, and Adams retired to his estate in Quincy, Massachusetts, and left public life. As president, Jefferson reduced the power and expenditures of the central government, but advocated for the purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France, which more than doubled the size of the United States. During his second administration, Jefferson faced renewed conflict with Great Britain, but he left office before the War of 1812 began. Jefferson retired to his estate in Monticello, Virginia, and he often advised presidential successors from there. He established the University of Virginia, which is a beautiful place, by the way, and Jefferson corresponded prolifically to John Adams to discuss politics and the state of the country they had begun, and these famous letters are regarded as masterpieces of American enlightenment, and again, go find them and read them. They're terrific. By remarkable coincidence, you can't make this stuff up, Jefferson and Adams died on the same day, Independence Day, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Adams' last words, where he had come back to consciousness for a brief time before passing in Massachusetts, were, "Thomas Jefferson still survives," in essence expressing his great peace in knowing that at least one founder of the nation had survived him and would be there to watch after the country, mentioning his esteem for the political adversary who, unbeknownst to Adams, had died just a few hours before on the very same day in Monticello. It's an interesting story about two founders out of the 56 and what they were thinking 50 years later after starting this country. One feeling well about the fact that he was passing because he thought the other survived. Only, I think, astonishing for both of them to show up at the pearly gates and look at one another and saying, "What are you doing here?" You can imagine what that conversation was like. So that is about all I have to share with you about the 4th of July today. I'm going to let you go off and have a good time now. I'm sure I'm overtime, right, Erica? Because these were long stories. I have 2 minutes to spare. Well, let's talk some more now. I want to thank you for being here. I hope you have a great holiday and you go off and enjoy your day as I will. I hope you will remember somewhere along the day people like Mike Christian and the founders and the reason we barbecue and drink beer. Anyway, we will see you next week. We will return to business as usual. We will be live on Facebook for you to see. Our guest will be Steve Lamott, who is the president and CEO of BIA Orange County. We will talk a little bit about some of the important issues facing our country, and we will have more features for you. Not sure what it'll be. I think we'll probably go back to teaching how to speak millennial. Anyway, enjoy your holiday. Have a great week between here and next Wednesday. Make good decisions, and we'll see you next Wednesday on the 11th for more Java with Jerry. Happy birthday, America.